There comes a moment, often quietly, when you realize that being the strong one, the one everyone looks to for answers, stability, or courage has changed you in ways you didn't notice at first. It doesn't happen all at once. It creeps in between conversations, in the silences that follow laughter, in the evenings when the room empties but your thoughts remain restless and unspoken. You begin to hear the weight of responsibility not in your voice but in your chest, in the rhythm of your breath, in the subtle stiffness of your shoulders. And perhaps, if you're honest, you've felt it too, the invisible shift from being present for others to questioning whether anyone sees you at all. When you are constantly relied upon, there is a quiet tension that builds inside. You carry fears, doubts, and questions that you cannot always share, because doing so might fracture the image others depend on. There is a moment in that tension where strength starts to feel both vital and isolating. You recognize that everyone's eyes are on you, seeking guidance, reassurance, or solutions, and yet the very act of being depended upon leaves little room to acknowledge your own vulnerability. It's a paradox. The more you are needed, the more unseen you sometimes feel. I remember imagined evenings where this awareness first surfaced. The world around me hummed with expectation, friends, colleagues, family, each interaction carrying the silent weight of needing me to be unflinching. And in that stillness, I began asking a question I could not easily answer. Is it possible to remain strong for others without losing touch with the parts of myself that are fragile, uncertain, or deeply human? That question lingered like a shadow across days filled with conversation, responsibility, and the quiet moments between them. It did not demand immediate solutions, yet it forced me to confront the hidden cost of constant strength. Strength, I realized, is rarely just physical or visible. It lives in the patience to listen when others need to speak, in the restraint to withhold judgment when emotions run high, in the courage to remain calm when chaos surrounds you. But when strength is always requested, always needed, it begins to demand something back. Recognition, understanding, or simply acknowledgement. And when that demand is unmet, a subtle fatigue seeps in, not from the tasks themselves, but from the constant navigation of emotional expectations. It is a weight carried silently, often invisible to those who depend on you most. There is an imagined memory that returns often in reflection. Sitting in a quiet room after a long day, hearing only the faint hum of distant city lights, and recognizing how often my own needs had been postponed, how often I had adjusted my voice, my mood, my focus to reassure, to guide, to stabilize. And in that realization, a soft, unsettling question arose: when everyone relies on your strength, who is left to lean on? It is not a question of complaining or weakness. It is the subtle awareness that being strong for others requires vigilance that few see, and that this vigilance quietly shapes the soul. I remember noticing how easily this invisible pressure could shape my decisions, my expressions, my energy. The urgency to protect, to solve, to perform a constant rhythm that sometimes left little space to breathe. I began observing the small ways it manifested. Speaking when I preferred to remain silent, providing answers before questions were fully formed, masking exhaustion behind a calm voice. And in those observations, I felt the first threads of understanding that strength is not merely the absence of weakness, but the careful balance of energy, presence, and emotional awareness. The paradox of being the strong one is that others' dependence can deepen your isolation, even as it magnifies your impact. You may feel gratitude for the trust placed in you, yet simultaneously, a quiet grief for the moments you cannot fully share. There is a subtle question that often accompanies this realization. Can strength coexist with vulnerability when every eye is on you? Can you honor your own humanity while remaining the anchor for those around you? The answer is neither simple nor immediate. It emerges slowly, in reflection, in the deliberate choice to acknowledge without oversharing, to remain present without losing yourself. I recall a night in this imagined reflection when I allowed myself to sit with these thoughts, alone in a dimly lit room, with only the gentle sound of my own breathing for company. I noticed how often I had sacrificed small pieces of myself to sustain the perception of unshakable strength. Not because it was expected overtly, but because dependence has its own quiet insistence. And yet, in that solitude, I also discovered something vital, that being the strong one does not require constant display. True strength grows in the spaces between performance, in the subtlety of patience. In the integrity of presence even when no one notices, I began to notice the interplay between responsibility and self-recognition. How often do we measure ourselves against the expectations of others rather than the truth of our own experience? And how often does that measurement blind us to the quiet forms of growth happening internally? Resilience, empathy, patience, discernment? These are the facets of strength that are rarely applauded, yet they are the ones that sustain the strong individual over decades, allowing him to remain reliable without sacrificing authenticity. In these reflections, a question gently emerged, persistent and quiet. What is the cost of always being the one others rely on? It is not measured in accolades, success, or recognition. It is measured in the subtle erosion of unobserved moments of unspoken fears, unmet needs, and the soft longing for permission to be human without consequence. And yet, in acknowledging this cost, there is also a liberation. For understanding the balance between strength for others and strength for oneself allows a new rhythm to form. A rhythm in which support and self-care coexist, where endurance is paired with reflection, and where reliability does not demand invisibility. As the night deepened, I imagined the slow unveiling of this truth. The strong one learns that not all burdens need to be carried loudly, not all guidance requires explanation, and not every moment demands proof of capability. There is a quiet mastery in knowing when to act, when to observe, when to simply exist as an anchor without performance. And perhaps the most profound discovery is that those who depend on you will often respond not to the volume of your strength, but to its consistency, its reliability, and its quiet presence in moments of uncertainty. I remember imagining in this reflective state the possibility of allowing my own needs to exist alongside those I carry for others, to honor my vulnerabilities without jeopardizing trust, to speak softly when words are necessary, and to sit in silence when presence alone suffices. In that imagined space, I glimpsed the subtle evolution of the strong individual, one who no longer measures himself solely by what he provides, but also by the depth of his own awareness, his patience, and his emotional fidelity. And in that awareness, another quiet question emerged. If strength can exist without performance, if resilience can coexist with vulnerability, then what does it truly mean to be the one everyone depends on? It is not the absence of difficulty, nor the constant solving of problems. It is the presence of integrity, patience, and quiet attentiveness. It is the understanding that being strong is not a singular act, but a continuous practice of balancing the needs of others with the truth of oneself. In the stillness of this reflection, I realized that being the strong one is not a role to perform, it is a responsibility to embody with care, patience, and honesty. It is a practice in which every silent decision, every unseen act of support, and every measured response contributes to a presence that is felt more than observed. And perhaps the greatest mastery of all is discovering that the quieter the strength, the more enduring it becomes, leaving an invisible but indelible mark on those who rely upon it. There are nights when the weight of being the one everyone depends on becomes almost tangible. I find myself revisiting those quiet rooms in my mind, where the soft glow of distant lights meets the hush of still air. It is in these imagined spaces that I begin to notice the subtle ways responsibility has shaped me, not in grand gestures, but in the pauses between them, the moments where words are held back, and the silence stretches longer than conversation ever did. Have you ever felt that tension? The one where giving too much voice risks breaking the calm, yet withholding it feels like denying the world the strength it seeks? It is in that tension that reflection begins. I remember an imagined evening where I watched others speak freely, their emotions spilling outward without restraint, while I observed quietly, weighing each word I might offer. It is not that I doubted the value of my voice. Rather, I questioned whether my expression would serve or simply amplify the noise. In those moments, I realized how often strength is mistaken for control. People expect decisiveness, clarity, and certainty, yet they rarely account for the patience, hesitation, and unseen contemplation that make true strength sustainable. There is a subtle artistry in restraint and awareness that not all problems demand immediate solutions, and not every burden needs to be vocalized. The paradox of dependence is that it is invisible. To those who lean on you, your quiet endurance is expected, natural, unremarkable. Yet internally, every decision, every act of support is deliberate. I recall imagining the way it feels to offer guidance while holding back your own exhaustion, to lead while acknowledging privately that you are still learning, still navigating your own doubts. It is a delicate balance, providing certainty without illusion, giving support without losing sight of self. And in recognizing this, a subtle question arises: can strength be authentic when it is constantly observed? Or does the presence of expectation shape the very essence of the strength you offer? I remember reflecting on how this invisible labor of being the strong one manifests in everyday choices. In imagined moments, I see myself listening longer than I might wish, smiling when fatigue presses against the edges of my patience, or explaining a truth before anyone fully understands its complexity. It is not performance, though it can feel like it is survival, the quiet negotiation of inner needs against external demands. And within these moments, I began to see a subtle pattern. The more I suppressed my own restlessness, the more my strength gained a calm depth. It was as though silence itself became a vessel, holding not just absence but intention, care, and presence. There is a memory I return to often: a quiet dinner, the hum of distant conversation surrounding me, while I notice how little of my own fatigue is acknowledged. Those I support, I imagine, carry their own burdens, yet my presence is expected, reliable, and unwavering. And I felt a quiet curiosity: how much of my strength is truly mine, and how much exists to meet the expectations of others? The question lingers, not as a complaint, but as an invitation to notice the unseen dynamics of emotional labor. In these reflective moments, I began to appreciate the subtle forms of endurance, the patience to remain silent, the courage to listen, the restraint to act only when necessary. I remember noticing, in this imagined reflection, how often I equated being needed with being worthy. That invisible thread had been woven early, the assumption that value is measured by the magnitude of support given, the intensity of guidance offered, the immediacy of presence. Yet, as I observed quietly, I realized that strength does not demand proof. It does not need constant recognition. Its truest expression is measured not by acknowledgement, but by the steady rhythm of being present, consistently, without fanfare. And with that understanding came a subtle relief. Strength can exist quietly, authentically, without requiring the world to witness it fully. I think of the small, almost invisible ways this plays out: a hand held when words fail, a presence that calms rather than instructs, a willingness to accept misunderstanding temporarily, knowing that clarity often arrives in its own time. These are the acts that define quiet strength, yet they are rarely celebrated. In imagining this, I began to see that the strongest men, the ones others lean on, often cultivate their power in private, unseen spaces. There is a richness to this solitude, a space for reflection, for internal calibration, for nurturing resilience without the pressure of performance. There is a tension inherent in this practice. When others expect unwavering guidance, every moment of silence carries weight. You may fear that withdrawing, even briefly, will disrupt the balance others rely on. Yet, stepping back gently can reveal a surprising truth. Presence is often more impactful when it is deliberate, measured, and unhurried. I imagine watching someone navigate their own challenges while I simply existed as an anchor, silently available. It was in this imagined observation that I glimpsed a profound realization. The strongest influence is not always vocal, not always visible. It is consistent, patient, and quietly empowering. In reflection, I noticed the paradox of endurance. The more deeply you invest yourself in others, the more your own internal boundaries demand attention. Emotional presence is not limitless. Strength is not infinite. And yet, when cultivated thoughtfully, it becomes regenerative. There is a subtle artistry to recognizing when to act, when to speak, and when to remain silently supportive. I began imagining how this practice changes over time. The strong one learns not just to respond to crises, but to anticipate the emotional rhythm of those around him, creating stability through observation, patience, and carefully measured engagement. And within this reflection arises another question, quietly insistent: what does it mean to remain fully present? Deeply engaged and yet emotionally undiminished? How does one balance giving to others while honoring one's own inner life? It is a question without immediate resolution, meant to linger in the mind like the quiet after a storm. And in its lingering, it shapes the way strength is expressed, no longer as a loud assertion, but as a subtle, enduring force that meets need without overshadowing, that holds space without intrusion, and that allows presence to be felt as much as it is seen. I remember sitting with these reflections in imagined evenings, the faint hum of distant city lights providing a steady rhythm, the stillness of the room amplifying my own thoughts. I noticed the gentle tension between duty and self-recognition, between external expectation and internal truth. And in that space I felt a soft, expansive curiosity. What if strength could evolve to encompass quiet resilience, deliberate patience, and a presence that nourishes without demanding acknowledgement? It is a possibility that reshapes the experience of being the one everyone relies upon. By the end of those reflections, I understood something vital. Being the strong one does not mean carrying every burden alone, nor does it require constant display of capability. It means learning to navigate the delicate balance between offering support and maintaining self-integrity. It is the practice of presence, quiet attentiveness, and patient observation. And it carries an unspoken promise that strength, when cultivated thoughtfully, becomes not just a tool for others, but a reflection of inner clarity, resilience, and humanity. As this quiet realization settled, I imagined the next layer of insight waiting, a reflection on how being the dependable one shapes not just action, but emotion, connection, and the subtle art of relating without exhaustion. A space where endurance meets introspection, and quiet presence becomes a deliberate choice rather than a response to expectation. In that imagined anticipation, I felt the stirrings of something deeper, waiting to unfold in the stillness that follows understanding. There is a subtle, almost imperceptible shift that occurs when you've carried the weight of others for long enough. At first, it is not dramatic. It does not announce itself with a sudden thunderclap or a visible change. Instead, it arrives quietly, in the pauses between conversations, in the way you linger a little longer over your own thoughts, in the moments when the world seems loud, but your response feels small, deliberate, and measured. Have you ever noticed that? The quiet that follows when you realize that the heaviest battles were never with anyone else, but within yourself. It is in that recognition that reflection begins anew, drawing attention to the space where patience, endurance, and unseen effort converge. I often imagine the evenings when I sit alone, tracing the patterns of light outside a window, letting the soft illumination of distant buildings remind me of lives unfolding quietly, unseen. There is an intimacy to observing this from a distance, a clarity that only solitude provides. It is in these imagined hours that I notice the contradictions of being relied upon. There is pride in capability, but also a subtle tension in realizing that your presence has become expected, almost habitual. And with that tension comes the first question: how do you remain genuinely present when your steadiness is assumed, when no one asks if you too are weathering storms? I recall imagined conversations where my advice was sought not for insight, but as a stabilizing force. People leaned on my voice, my decisions, my calm, without knowing the quiet calculation behind each response. And I wondered how much of this strength is performative, shaped by expectation, and how much is authentic, emerging naturally from patience and experience. There is a subtle awareness in realizing that those who depend on you may never fully grasp the quiet labor it takes to maintain your composure. And yet, there is a deeper satisfaction in knowing that presence itself, even when invisible, has a steadying effect. In reflection, I notice how often the strongest men, the ones quietly relied upon, develop resilience not in the spotlight, but in the spaces where no one watches. It is the discipline of listening when it is easier to speak, the courage to step back when action is expected, and the patience to hold your own vulnerability close while tending to others' needs. I imagine the evenings where this practice unfolded slowly, the decision to remain silent, to let others speak their truth, and to offer insight only when it aligns with what is necessary. Each quiet act becomes a reinforcement of trust, not through words but through presence. There is a memory I return to often in these imagined reflections, a late night where exhaustion pressed against me, yet I remained seated, listening to someone else's anxieties unfold. There was no applause, no acknowledgement, only the quiet understanding that my stillness allowed them to be heard. It is here, in these imagined moments, that the paradox of being the strong one becomes clear. Influence is not always declared. Sometimes it is simply the space you provide, and in recognizing this, I feel a deepening curiosity. How can strength persist without being observed, validated, or even understood? I notice the subtle ways expectation shapes behavior. When everyone depends on you, every choice carries weight. Every action is scrutinized, and even in silence, there is a sense of responsibility. I imagine the evenings where I weigh each interaction, considering the emotional ripple it may create. There is a delicate tension between giving freely and preserving your own emotional reserves. And in that tension, I sense the beginnings of a profound realization that true strength is not measured by output, but by balance, the capacity to support without depletion, to be present without surrendering self. I think of the small, intimate ways this manifests. A patient word, a steady hand, a willingness to observe and let others navigate their own understanding. Each act is subtle, almost invisible, yet profoundly impactful. And in imagining this, I realize that the strongest men cultivate not only resilience, but discernment, the ability to choose when to act, when to speak, and when to allow silence to communicate more powerfully than any word ever could. There is a quiet artistry in this approach, a mastery of presence that is as deliberate as it is invisible, and yet there is a subtle cost. To sustain this quiet strength, one must confront the vulnerability that comes with dependence. You must navigate moments of unspoken expectation, the fear of being misunderstood, or the quiet resentment that can arise when effort goes unnoticed. I imagine these evenings where reflection becomes a dialogue with oneself, how to maintain clarity, presence, and emotional stability while honoring the fact that you are human, that you tire, that you too carry unseen burdens. There's an internal negotiation here, a balance that is never fully resolved but constantly refined. I remember imagining the evenings when I sensed the emotional rhythms of those around me. I observed how support, when consistent but unobtrusive, cultivates trust more than words ever could. And in that observation, I encountered a quiet revelation. Being the one others depend on is not about control, performance, or display. It is about patience, listening, and the quiet mastery of presence. True strength is not shouted. It is lived, felt, and perceived subtly, often without acknowledgement. As reflection deepens, another question emerges, quietly insistent. How does one maintain authenticity while being relied upon? How does a strong presence remain human, fallible, and self-aware without fracturing under expectation? It is a question that does not seek immediate resolution. Rather, it is meant to linger, shaping the way strength is experienced and expressed. And in that lingering, I begin to understand the profound gift of quiet influence. It allows others to grow, while ensuring that the foundation, the one who sustains, observes, and steadies, remains whole. I notice in my imagined reflections how endurance becomes an art, not in outward demonstrations, but in internal calibration. There is skill in knowing when to offer guidance and when to simply witness, when to speak and when to allow the natural unfolding of understanding. I imagine these quiet moments where patience outweighs urgency, where the rhythm of presence replaces the need for immediate resolution. And within this imagined practice, strength transforms from a performative act to an internal compass, guiding not through authority, but through stability, attention. And so, in these evenings of reflection, I observe the subtle evolution of being the strong one. I notice the ways in which reliance, expectation, and unseen responsibility shape presence, patience, and emotional clarity. There is a quiet rhythm that emerges, a balance between engagement and introspection, action and observation, self and others. It is in this rhythm that true strength takes root steady. Invisible and profoundly enduring in this imagined reflection, I begin to anticipate the next layer, the exploration of how quiet strength shapes not only presence, but connection, love, and the ability to support others without losing oneself. It is a space where endurance meets emotional clarity, where being relied upon becomes not a burden, but a deliberate practice of presence and intention. And as this anticipation unfolds, there is a gentle curiosity, a quiet tension that prepares the mind for what comes next, understanding the subtle power of consistent, unobserved strength. There is a stillness that begins to settle when the weight of responsibility has been carried long enough. It is not abrupt. It does not announce itself with urgency or drama. Instead, it arrives softly, in the quiet intervals between decisions, in the moments when the world seems to demand action but your mind lingers, observing, weighing, reflecting. Have you ever felt that? The calm that emerges when you realize that your strongest influence comes not from doing more, but from being steady and seen, patient, deliberate. It is in that calm that understanding begins to unfold, a quiet education in the art of sustained presence. I often imagine evenings where the light has softened, fading slowly into the horizon. The world's chaos continues beyond my window, but inside there is a gentle clarity. It is in this solitude that I confront the subtle paradox of strength, that the very quality which others rely upon most often goes unacknowledged, even unnoticed. There is a moment when you notice that your constancy has become expected, that your steady hand, your measured voice, your calm endurance have become the backdrop against which everyone else moves. And in that recognition, a question surfaces: how do you remain genuine when expectation is constant, when your quiet influence is assumed rather than sought? I recall imagined nights where I observed the rhythm of others' lives, noticing how they leaned on me without understanding the quiet work it takes to remain composed. There is a tension in that awareness, the desire to support without overextending, to guide without controlling, to care without sacrificing oneself entirely. And in those imagined moments, I began to understand a subtle truth. The strongest men, the ones everyone depends on, often learn patience not as a virtue to display, but as a necessity for survival. It is a quiet endurance that sustains both themselves and those around them. I notice the way small decisions accumulate. Each moment of restraint, each measured response, each pause before speaking, it all forms a quiet architecture of strength. I imagine evenings where reflection becomes a practice of observing the internal landscape, the emotions that rise when others expect too much, the awareness of one's own limits, the negotiation between presence and withdrawal. And in this practice, I see the emergence of a profound skill, the ability to hold one's ground while remaining soft, attentive, and emotionally present. There is subtlety here, a kind of mastery that is largely invisible yet deeply effective. It is in these imagined reflections that I recognize the paradox of being relied upon. The more others lean on you, the more you must understand yourself. There is no shortcut, no external validation sufficient to confirm your endurance. Instead, there is a slow, deliberate cultivation of inner clarity. I imagine evenings where the only applause is the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you have been present, steady, and aligned not for recognition, but for the integrity of the work itself. And in that alignment, there emerges another question. How does one maintain authenticity when every interaction carries the weight of expectation? I return to imagined moments of subtle insight, noticing how often patience and listening accomplish more than words ever could. There is a rhythm and understanding when to speak, when to wait, and when to simply allow space for others to find their own clarity. It is a form of strength that does not assert itself through volume or performance, but through consistency, attentiveness, and deliberate presence. And in this recognition, I feel the quiet satisfaction of discovery, that enduring influence often resides in what is unobserved, in the small, deliberate acts that shape others' lives without fanfare. Yet there is a tension that accompanies this quiet mastery. Even as presence becomes a stabilizing force, there is an internal negotiation, the fear of being misunderstood, the awareness that reliance can breed expectation, the subtle longing for acknowledgement that rarely arrives. I imagine evenings spent reflecting on these dynamics, noting the delicate balance between support and self-preservation. And in this reflection, a deeper truth surfaces. True strength is not the absence of struggle, but the ability to navigate it with clarity, calm, and intention. I think of the subtle ways in which this manifests. A measured response to frustration, a gentle but firm boundary, a listening ear offered without need for validation. Each act is small, deliberate, and invisible, yet profoundly impactful. I imagine evenings where such acts accumulate, shaping the environment, influencing decisions, and guiding others not through overt power, but through quiet, consistent presence. And as I observe this imagined pattern, I am reminded that the strongest influence is often unacknowledged, carried in silence, and recognized only through the outcomes it shapes. There is a memory, imagined yet vivid, of an evening where I simply observed, offering no advice, no intervention, only attention. The person across from me spoke freely, unburdened by expectation, and I realized then that the act of presence, calm, steady, patient, was more valuable than any solution I could have offered. Strength, I understood, is not measured by action alone, but by the capacity to hold space without interference, to support without controlling, and to influence without drawing attention to oneself. As these reflections deepen, another layer emerges. I consider how quiet strength shapes not only presence but connection. The ability to maintain emotional balance while others navigate their own storms is a rare skill. It requires patience, observation, and a willingness to remain vulnerable, even when the work of support goes unseen. I imagine evenings where this practice unfolds naturally, the steady voice, the careful timing, the deliberate silence that allows others to grow. And in that unfolding, a question lingers softly: how do you remain fully human, fully present, and fully engaged while carrying the weight of reliance without losing yourself? I notice in my reflections that endurance is an art, subtle and largely invisible. It is expressed in pauses, in measured words, in the conscious decision to observe rather than act. I imagine evenings spent refining this internal rhythm, understanding when to assert influence and when to allow events to unfold organically. And in this refinement, I perceive the quiet transformation. The strongest presence is not loud, commanding, or visible. It is patient, observant, and intentional. Strength becomes both a practice and a state of being. In these imagined moments, I begin to anticipate the final stage of understanding. The realization that being the strong one everyone depends on is not about power, recognition, or control. It is about cultivating presence, sustaining influence quietly, and mastering the delicate balance between support and self-preservation. The journey continues, and as I sit with this thought, I feel the gentle curiosity of discovery waiting ahead, how this quiet mastery shapes love, connection, and the ability to maintain integrity while being endlessly relied upon. There comes a point in this imagined journey where the quiet weight of responsibility no longer feels like burden, it feels like a rhythm, a pulse that exists beneath every thought and movement. It is in this rhythm that the deepest form of strength reveals itself, not through force, but through consistent presence. I imagine evenings where the sky softens into shades of indigo and silver, where the world outside continues in its chaos, yet inside there is a gentle steadiness, a quiet heartbeat that reminds you of the work done, the patience maintained, and the lives touched without fanfare. Have you ever noticed how silence can carry its own kind of resonance? It is in that resonance that understanding takes shape, and the strongest influence is often invisible. I think back to imagined nights where I observed those who leaned upon me, noticing how subtly they moved, how unconsciously they relied on steadiness I rarely spoke about. There was no expectation of applause, no reward for effort, only the slow accumulation of trust built through presence. And in those observations, I became aware of the delicate paradox of being the strong one. The more you give, the less often it is acknowledged, but the deeper the impact, the more it endures. I asked myself quietly whether the quiet work, the invisible support, the patient endurance, was it enough to matter? And in that question, I realized the answer was always in the subtle ways lives are shaped around us. Often without ever knowing, the evenings I imagine now are filled with reflection, with noticing how restraint itself can be a gift. Speaking less, observing more, offering strength without demanding recognition, these are not acts of passivity, but intentional forms of care. There is a profound dignity in this restraint, a measured patience that creates safety, not spectacle. I imagine holding space for someone without words, allowing them to feel heard through the steadiness of presence rather than through explanations or advice. And in that space, I sense the paradox again. The more quietly you exist in service of others, the more your influence grows, even when unnoticed. I recall imagined moments where I confronted the subtle internal tension of being endlessly relied upon. There is always a temptation to over-explain, to assert control, to remind others of the effort required. Yet I have learned that true strength is not in proving your worth, but in simply showing up consistent, calm, and attentive, allowing the work of influence to unfold naturally. I imagine evenings spent observing my own reflection, considering the boundaries that allow me to remain whole while still being dependable. And in that reflection, another question emerges. How do you balance availability with preservation, generosity with self-respect, connection with personal integrity? The answer, I imagine, does not arrive all at once. It unfolds slowly in the quiet moments, in the patience cultivated over years of practice. There is a beauty in the subtle rhythm of endurance, the quiet observation of emotions, the careful timing of words, the conscious decision to act when it matters most and to remain silent when presence alone suffices. I imagine evenings where I sit with that understanding, feeling the slow shift from effort to alignment, from obligation to authentic connection. And in that shift, there is relief, a gentle reassurance that strength is not measured by recognition, but by fidelity to oneself and to those we hold in care. I notice how love and connection are transformed by this quiet mastery. When influence is exercised without performance, when patience replaces insistence, and when listening becomes more powerful than speaking, relationships begin to flourish in ways that force cannot achieve. I imagine evenings where someone across from me feels safe enough to reveal themselves fully, without pretense, without guarding, simply because the environment has been shaped by steady, quiet presence. And I realize then that the work of being the strong one is not just in carrying burdens or offering guidance, it is in creating a container for trust, empathy, and intimacy that words alone cannot sustain. There is an imagined memory, vivid in its subtlety, of sitting quietly while someone expressed their struggles, their fears, their quiet anxieties. I offered no immediate solutions, no insistence, no guidance. I simply listened, allowing them to fill the space with their truth. And in that moment, I felt the power of quiet strength, the capacity to hold, to witness, and to remain grounded, even when the lives around you tremble with uncertainty. It is a lesson repeated countless times in imagination. Sometimes the strongest act is not to act at all, but to remain unwavering. I reflect on the cumulative weight of such evenings, and I begin to see the final stage of quiet mastery, understanding that strength is not about being needed. It is about being steady enough that your presence allows others to navigate life's uncertainty without collapsing under it. There is no dramatic revelation, no outward applause. Instead, there is the subtle satisfaction of alignment, the recognition that the quiet rhythm of consistency, care, and attention shapes lives more profoundly than any display of force ever could. And with that recognition, I notice another question arises softly. How do you continue to sustain yourself, emotionally and spiritually, when your influence is largely unseen? The answer, I imagine, lies in presence itself. To be strong is to be conscious of your own emotional landscape, to nurture yourself with as much care as you offer to others. Even in the quietest moments, the act of simply being fully aligned with your own values becomes a source of renewal. I picture evenings where reflection is an act of restoration, observing one's breath, noticing the cadence of thoughts, acknowledging emotions without judgment. In that practice, the strongest ones regain balance, replenishing themselves without fanfare, preparing for the next day, the next need, the next unseen moment where quiet endurance matters most. I notice that influence, when exercised with quiet integrity, does not demand attention. It is gravitational rather than performative. Others respond naturally, subtly, often without consciously realizing why. I imagine the soft realization that the loudest gestures, the most dramatic efforts are rarely as enduring as the steady, patient, invisible acts that shape character, decision, and growth over time. And in that realization, a final insight forms: the strongest presence is not loud. It is aligned, consistent, and deeply human, capable of sustaining both itself and those around it. In these imagined evenings, as the world quiets and the light softens, I reflect on the subtle evolution that comes with being the one everyone depends on. Strength is no longer measured by action or assertion, but by fidelity to oneself, patience, and the careful cultivation of presence. Love, care, and influence are exercised through quiet attention, deliberate timing, and emotional attunement. And I realize that the truest form of strength is not seen in moments of triumph, but in the daily, consistent, invisible choices to be steady, available, and authentically aligned. I leave these imagined nights with a gentle curiosity. How might we all cultivate such quiet mastery in our own lives? How might endurance, patience, and presence become our most profound form of influence? And I imagine that, in exploring these questions, we discover that the quietest strength is the one that resonates longest, touches deepest, and endures beyond recognition, beyond applause, beyond the noise of the world. It is a strength that waits, listens, and persists, not for reward, but for truth.